Noted author and Harvard business professor David Garvin has helped everyone from the U.S. Army to LL Bean and Boeing Aircraft to General Electric. He's a world expert at showing these complex organization managers how they can build more effective learning organizations, how they can transfer knowledge, how they can improve both their organization and themselves by acquiring, interpreting, and applying this knowledge. Garvin knows the hands-on tools for kickstarting and sustaining this vital cultural learning process. And Garvin's time-tested and proven methods really work. Now he's even inspiring the wildland fire community with his critical hands-on organizational learning practices and guidelines.
What I want to do here is I want to do 4 or 5 things. The first is I want to provide just a little bit of motivation. Now, we all did learning in school, but why is learning important for your work? Now, what difference does it make to be a learning organization? The second is I want to provide you with a pretty crisp definition. What is a learning organization? And then we can apply it to your own groups. The third, and this is where I want to spend most of the time, is I want to describe to you 6 critical activities that learning organizations do. Things like sharing knowledge across different parts of the organization. And I want to give you lots of practical examples, mostly from companies. That's where we're going to have to apply them, about how these things can be done. Literally stuff you could do Monday when you get back to work. So as practical, as grounded as possible. And then the fourth thing I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about what it means for you to lead learning processes. Because that really becomes part of your jobs if you're going to move the organization forward. And it's a little bit different from the traditional view of leadership. Now, the activity you're engaged in is not a competitive one. But fires are getting bigger and more complex. The only way you can get ahead of them is to learn. To learn from fire activities elsewhere, other regions, perhaps other countries. To share what you've learned on one fire with another group on a related fire. Or even in the course of day-to-day events, find out something done unusually well and quickly pass it on to the next group. And we'll see a lot of this in AARs. I mean, the Army found, for instance, when it was in Bosnia, first group of troops in, quickest thing they found was if you found a snow-covered road without tracks, it typically meant it was mined. You wanted to pass that information around as soon as you could to make sure no other units found it out the hard way. That's learning. If there are any questions about why learning matters to the performance of the organization, any comments, any questions, please don't feel shy. I mean, this is really, the more interactive, the more interesting it'll be for everybody.
Well, we have to learn quickly because the consequences of something going wrong are getting worse. I mean, going back to your first slide that says the future ain't what it used to be. In the political environment, they're looking to hang us up. They want a scapegoat, and we're just trying to get a job done. And so if we screw up, we can't replicate it too many times before they take our toys away.
Okay, that's a very important point. I mean, one of the things that we'll talk about is that one of the tests you can use if you're a learning organization is, does the organization make the same mistake twice? Mistakes happen. That's a fact of life. Now, you don't want mistakes to happen, but the real test is, did we make the same mistake a second time? Yes?
I don't think we're learning as fast as we should, because every time you look at a fatality investigation or the findings, it all points back that we're doing the same mistakes over and over and over. We're just not learning.
Why do you think that is? Any thoughts?
Maybe the lack of experience in our leadership, because we're going through such a high turnover rate now. People are retiring, and we're not I don't think we're catching up yet.
Okay, you've just generated another important test for whether or not you're a learning organization. If when key people leave, the learning goes with them, you don't have a learning organization. You have people who learn, but a real good litmus test is if when somebody has all the information in their head and they leave the organization and the organization loses its knowledge, you don't meet the test of a learning organization. There are three pieces. The first is leadership. And it's really up to you how you lead learning. Leading learning is different from the traditional model. The second is, do we have the right processes to ask those questions? That's what the AR is really all about. But the third, which we're going to spend a fair amount of time on in a few minutes, is, do we have the right culture? Because not every culture supports active learning. Some of them actually do a pretty good job of dampening or suppressing learning. Yes?
You know, another way to look at the fatalities that I tend to, the way I look at it, because we've been doing it for however long we've been fighting fires, that maybe we're teaching people to do something they just shouldn't be doing.
Say a bit more about that.
Well, we've been teaching people to go out and fight fire aggressively. Oh, by the way, do it safely. I'm a firm believer if we're going to break the cycle, maybe we shouldn't be going out and fighting fire aggressively.
Yeah, safety's a tough one. I mean, I'll tell you a little story about safety, because it's not the focus here, but it's something obviously you want to spend some time on. Paula mentioned that I'd done a fair amount of work with BP, British Petroleum. And they told me a wonderful story about safety, because they did not have the safety culture that they wanted to have. It was very much, go out on the rigs and drill for oil, and oh, by the way, be safe. And they invited some folks from DuPont to come and visit their oil rigs. Now, I don't know, for those of you who know safety, DuPont has the best safety record in the world on any measure. It's just astonishing. It's like invisible fatalities. And these two guys came out from DuPont to visit the BP oil rig. It's one of the rigs in the North Sea. They showed up, and you know, there are these safety boxes with all the special gear. They open up the first safety box. This is literally the start of their tour. And they can't believe their embarrassment. It's missing 2 life preservers, a few Band-Aids, some sterile gauze tape, and a few other relatively insignificant items. The BP guys, oh my goodness, we're really embarrassed. We'll write it up, and they move on. And the DuPont guys are still standing by the safety box. And they asked the guys from BP, what are you doing? And the BP guy says, well, we're continuing the tour. We'll write it up, we'll move on, we want to show you the rest of the rig. And the guys from DuPont said, you don't understand, do you? Shut it down. Guys from BP said, what? DuPont says, shut it down. There's a discrepancy. That's the way you get safety. There's no grays here. Either you met the standards or you didn't. So safety's a tough one. We may circle back to it.
This came out because our new forest supervisor in our forest, he just flat said, we're not going to do what we've been doing in the past. And if that means we're not going to go out and fight fire, we're not going to do it. Because there isn't one life it's worth doing that. We're going to try a new approach here.
Let's say we always talk about fatalities, but the lessons we learn from them sometimes aren't really topical or in a timely manner, and so we're not learning from them. And again, this year a good example is the Kramer fatalities. You know, I read everything I can about fatalities, and I don't know anything about it. And so how do we expect to learn from those incidents without us in the organization pass that information on?
Okay, let me say 2 or 3 words about this, because you're onto some important issues. The first is that you don't only learn from the worst cases. I mean, so we've had several comments around fatalities. You know, how many of you know anything about the Aviation Safety Reporting System, ASRS? Okay, let me quickly describe it to everybody else. ASRS is a system where if there's a near miss in air traffic control, so an airline pilot violates spacing, if that pilot writes up the near miss and submits it, I believe the paperwork's done by NASA, the incident is expunged from their record. Now, the reason why NASA does this is they want to see if there are patterns. You want to see if collectively the near misses add up in a way. So it's not just the fatalities you learn from. You often learn more from the close calls. So that's one. The second is, I want to make one point up front because it should be clear from this kind of stuff, but it's real important you get it. Learning is an investment. Okay? The problem with learning is that most people think it's free. It's not free. You're all here. You're here for a day and a half. You could be doing other things. It's an investment with a big, big payback. But you've got to invest the time. AARs take time. One of the things you'll see is that one of the reasons why the Army does them is that they literally define mission completion as it ends with an AAR. If you haven't done the AAR, you haven't completed the mission. So the investment's built into the process. The third piece about the learning, which again I want to flag because you'll see it with the AARs, is the most powerful learning is timely. When I teach a new class, I literally debrief the 25 minutes right after class. I don't schedule anything, because if I did, by the time I got around to writing stuff up, I'd forget it. So part of the learning cycle is don't wait 6 months to learn from it. Don't read the report. We've got to figure out ways to get the learning together with the people who need to learn much more quickly. And we'll talk again about how you do that with AARs. A few other comments or questions? Yeah.
As far as the accidents, fatalities that we've had for the past, I don't care how far you go back, we haven't invented any new ways of killing ourselves in fire. So the point I'm trying to make is, if you can take a look at an accident, if you can't figure out what happened, there's nothing new there. Something got broken that we know how to do. Somebody didn't do what they were supposed to do. Okay. And I just wanted to make that point, and I think...
Let me capture that, because there's a real important issue here. Learning's got two pieces. Actually, it's got three, but there are two of them which you flag, and they're different. The first one is knowing what to do. But you've got a second one, which in many ways is even more important. Doing what we know. We've got the best practice. Okay? This is the problem of finding the best practice, sharing the best practice, figuring out the best way to do something. This is making sure people are actually following through. Learning's got two components. It's knowing and doing. And you'll see when I get to the definition, most organizations fail the second test. A lot more than they fail. That's why AARs are so powerful. Because they're real-time, quick. What we set out to do, what do we actually do? There's a saying, to learn, one must be humble. Now, there's a reason for that. Think about what learning requires. Learning requires you to admit that somebody else may have a better way. That it's just possible we're not doing this thing as well as we possibly can. The problem is you also have to have a fair amount of self-confidence, because you're doing things that are quite dangerous. One of the guys a fellow who took over a failing hospital and turned it around, I once asked him about how he would summarize his attitude, and he captured both of those pieces. He said, people call me, he says, they say I have arrogant humility. It was actually a pretty good characterization. He's arrogant that he thinks he can do it. He's humble in that he's not always sure he's got the best way, and he's willing to learn from other people. And this, by the way, will come out in decision making, because what you'll see with the decision making is that as you lead your crews, as you lead your teams, ultimately you have to make the final call. It's not about giving up authority. On the other hand, if you don't listen, you know, there's this wonderful old saying. I once was at a meeting where this guy was just arrogant. He wasn't humble. In the middle of the meeting, the guy said, look, if we both listen to what I say, we'll both know what I think. That's perhaps erring on a little bit of the wrong side of the arrogant comment. Unfortunately, a lot of leaders do that. I'm going to show you some techniques for getting both, for balancing the seesaw. Any other comments? Yes?
I got one more. Another observation that I've made, and it's going back to what you said about investment, is those of us managers that are left with the knowledge, we're not getting out there enough to teach that knowledge. Maybe because they don't care anymore. They're a year or so from retirement, or they're bogged down with paperwork. So in order for me to do a good AAR, I'm going to have to be there. You know, and that takes time and a lot of investment.
Yeah. There's, let me give you another saying. There's a famous saying in the corporate world that if you don't do anything about it, the urgent drives out the important. I will bet that's even more true in the fire community. The urgent is what's at the top of the list. It's the #1 to-do item. The problem is that's not necessarily the most important thing you've got to do then. Learning is often the most important thing, but it doesn't float to the top. That's got a real practical implication. You've got to plan ahead for learning. You've got to build it into certain processes so that it happens by design. And you've got to convince people there's a practical implication here. You know, didn't take long in Bosnia for people to realize that, we just learned that snow-covered roads without tracks are mined. This was a pretty worthwhile investment of our time. You can do the same thing. And you'll see, by the way, in the way the AAR process works in the Army, they circulate in the field AAR results daily. This is not just about long-term lessons learned. This is also about real-time lessons learned. Because those are the ones where people say, wow, this could have saved a life. Okay, any other comments or before we move on to the definition? Let's take this last one.
In a large decentralized agency like the Forest Service, if they lose 4 prescribed burns this year, have they made the same mistake? Or are those isolated events? There's lots of different people executing.
The short answer is I don't know. You've got to look at the cause. I mean, you asked before cause and effect relationship. You've got to look at the cause and effect relationship. If it's the same cause and the same effect, then yep, it's the same mistake. If it's different causes and different effects, no, it's not the same. And in fact, and I want to be clear here, I've read a few of these reports, and at least 1 or 2 of them were, we did everything, and 4 days into the burn, the Weather Service was just plain wrong, and the wind swept up to 40 knots, blew the fire through the canyon. That's not a mistake. That's an unanticipated consequence. There's not a whole lot you can do about those. And understandably, there's political fallout from that, which in my view is unfair. But we're talking about things where once we looked at it, we would do it differently the next time around. People will only contribute if they feel there's incentives in that direction, if they feel that learning is valued. Now, value comes in many different forms. Some of it is financial compensation. That's what Disney does. But it doesn't have to be that way. Recognition is a powerful form of saying, It's a great idea. We value it. And it's your idea, and we're going to feature you in brochures, in booklets, in whatever. So that's a part of the I mean, again, let me jump ahead because we'll come back to this. Every single thing we've talked about so far rests on a foundation. I want to make the foundation explicit, and we'll deal with it in a few minutes. Nothing happens toward becoming a learning organization if you don't have a culture that supports and encourages learning. Recognition's a piece of it. We're going to spend a fair amount of time detailing out the elements of a learning culture. Because everything else, you can have the best AR process in the world, but if people don't feel that learning is genuinely valued, they're not going to be forthcoming. All of us carry mental models. And in particular, the folks who've always been doing it that way are convinced it always should be done that way. Except if technology changes, public exposure and political pressure changes, weather systems do evolve, you often need to change the mental models. And it's one of the reasons why you always need to encourage differing points of view. So there's this reason why you need confidence, but you need a willingness to hear the other side. So that's interpreting. Now, transferring and retaining, we've actually already talked about. If you have an organization where we do something very well in one part of the organization, but the other parts of the organization don't do it equally well, you don't have a learning organization by this test. You have individual pockets of excellence, but if you haven't transferred knowledge, you haven't been able to be a learning organization. Now, let me give you, I'll jump ahead, talk to you a little bit about why this is so hard to do. Okay? And we're going to make up an example. So let's take, I don't know how you, what's a region or a zone? Could you give me a region or a zone?
Changes from organization to organization, or agency to agency.
Okay. Missoula, Montana. Is that a...
Depends. If it's Forest Service, it's Region 1.
Region 1. Okay, okay, Region 1. You're from Region 1. Now, I come out and I say to this group, I want you all, what's your name?
Courtney.
Courtney. I want you all to go visit Courtney in Region 1. They have the best record on every single measure we care about in prescribed fires and fire suppression. They're terrific on every count. I want you to go visit and learn from Courtney and her people. How are you feeling about Region 1 right about now? Over my dead body. She can't be all that good. They're hiding something that nobody doesn't know about. Okay? This is the common problem with transferring knowledge. One, all of you go to the mountaintop and learn from the only expert who does anything right in this organization. Prescription for disaster. Even if you're the best there is.
I'm good.
Okay. Now, let me give you the solution to the problem. I actually discovered it at Rank Xerox, the British arm of Xerox. It's a brilliant idea. It's simple as all get out. Rank Xerox runs Europe. So they have 9 countries. So they put together a team, and they say to the task force, find the best practices on the sales side. 1 each for every country. And your counterpart would be 1 each for every region. So this team goes out, and they say, turns out Denmark is the very best at selling small copiers. Turns out France is the very best at selling complicated 4-color copiers. And they document 1 best practice from each of 9 countries. And then they say to the country managers, the head of the regions, next year, each of you has to adopt 4 practices. We don't care which ones, but you gotta pick 4. Now, what just happened? What did we just do to the problem that we had a few minutes ago?
Give it ownership.
How do we give it ownership?
By letting them make a decision.
Number one, we gave them choice. You can go to any 4 of the 9. But what happened to this city on the hill problem? How did we solve that problem?
Brought it down.
You disseminated it through different people so that then it wasn't like you have the one all-knowing, and it kind of made everybody else feel like, hey, you know, we did something right too.
Exactly. All of a sudden, everybody's the best at something. All of a sudden, we leveled the playing field. Everybody becomes a teacher, and everybody becomes a student. The problem literally went away. This is a fairly large-scale operation. It cost them $1 million to benchmark everything. In the first year, the net addition to Rank Xerox's sales was $100 million. The year after that, they added an additional $150 million. And it was largely because they gave them choice, and they said, everybody's got something they're good at. All of a sudden, you get the flows in multiple directions. Okay? So that's transferring and retaining knowledge. Purposefully modifying its behavior to reflect new knowledge and insights. Purposely means in pursuit of the organization's goals. That's the important piece here. Learning is not random. We don't send people to classes just because it's fun to take classes or because we have an education requirement. It's got to be clearly aligned with the goals. And the other piece is modifying the behavior. This is doing what we know. This is the hard test. I want to give you one more personal story and then we'll break. For many years, my field of work was quality improvement and quality management. And I had done years of research, literally over a dozen years of work. And I'd written case studies and books and articles. And I was presenting to a group of senior executives at the business school. It's a group called the Advanced Management Program. Little lacking in discipline. Huh? In the middle of one of these presentations, one of the guys in the back of the room, I'll never forget, a Swiss banker, he actually didn't raise his hand, he just shouted it out. He said, David, look, that stuff sounds great, but do you folks at Harvard Business School actually practice quality management? And I scratched my head and dodged it for a while, and finally I said, hell no, we only teach the stuff. And I realized afterwards we failed the test of doing what we know. I'd met that first test. I created new knowledge. I'd done all kinds of research in the United States and Japan. I had interpreted lots of data from factories. I'd gone into the factories, rolled up my sleeves, visited assembly lines. I'd certainly transferred it. I taught it in almost every class. And we'd retained it because I'd written books and articles and case studies. But we as an organization had never changed our behavior to reflect what we had learned. And we subsequently put in a training process. Interestingly, for administration and staff, but not for faculty. And we began the process of applying what we knew. That's often the hardest test. Learning organization tries to do 6 things. And we're going to spend a fair amount of time on each of these in turn, but particularly a few of them because they're probably most relevant. First, it collects intelligence about the environment. In a business setting, that means it collects information on customers, competitors, regulatory affairs, social trends. In your setting, it literally means the physical environment. What's the current state of the weather? What's it likely to be? How do we learn more about it? It learns from the best practices of other organizations. So, fancy way of saying benchmarking. And as you'll see, benchmarking is not only within your community, but benchmarking can also be carried out across different kinds of communities. And I'll show you what that means in a few minutes. Most important for our purposes today, a learning organization learns from its own experiences and past history. This is where AARs come in. After-action reviews are no more than a way of saying the past is relevant to what we do today and tomorrow. Most organizations do just the opposite. They sweep the past under the rug. They either declare victory and move on, or they try to keep failures quiet and move on. Both are opportunities for learning. They experiment with new approaches. It's a fancy way of saying they try new things. They encourage systematic problem solving. Now, we'll spend some time on the word systematic, because all organizations solve problems. Not all of them do it that carefully. And sixth, and we've already talked a little bit about this, they transfer knowledge throughout the organization. All of your organizations, to some degree, are already doing all of these things. You wouldn't continue to exist if you weren't. The world's changing. Fires are not the same today as they were yesterday. You are all doing some of these things. You're probably not doing all of them as well as you could. So the best I can do is give you a series of examples, best practice techniques from other settings. AAR comes from the Army, that you can adapt for your use. But third, recognize that at some level, some of learning is always an art. It's that leap of insight. It's that stretch of imagination. It's somebody who says, I think the fire's going west. I'm not quite sure why. Somewhere in our past we had a fire just like this one. You can't reduce all of learning to routine. I'm going to teach you technique. But remember, even the best artists practice their technique. Okay, so that's our focus. It'll be around technique. Now, the other piece, and this is worth spending a fair amount of time on, is that none of this, as I said, none of this will take place without first creating a learning culture. Learning culture is one that supports and encourages learning. Now, here's what I want us to do. You're organized in tables. I'd like each table to take a few minutes, work at your table, and try to answer these questions. Basically, there are three broad questions. The first is, what's a learning culture? What kind of mindsets, what kinds of behaviors, what kinds of ways of working are required? That's question one. Question two, which of those have been most difficult for us? Either the firefighting community broadly or your particular regions or units. And third, what's getting in the way? What's stopping us? Okay? So take some time at your tables, and what we'll do is once the tables feel comfortable with the questions, we'll compare notes. We'll pool our insights to see what we find. Because this is the baseline requirement for making the learning organization come to life. So let's start with the first broad issue. What goes into a learning culture? What are some of the elements of a culture that supports and encourages learning? What were some of your observations? Yes?
Willingness to be criticized.
Terrific. Willingness to be criticized. Why is that important for learning? Should be obvious.
You realize you make mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, nobody gets it right the first time, the second time, the third time, all the time. You've got to be willing to accept criticism. What are some other elements of a learning culture. Yes?
I think you have to be willing to accept change.
Willing to accept change.
I mean, it's just not always, the way you've been doing it in the past is not always the right way.
And it's not unrelated to willingness to accept criticism. Somebody may tell you there's new ways and different ways. Yes?
I think not only accept change, but facilitate change and be able to look.
Change, by the way, the link between learning and change should be very clear to you. If the rate of learning isn't greater than or equal to the rate of change, you're flying blind. That's why you need to learn. You'll learn to do new things so the organization can change. Okay?
I think even more important than the willingness to accept change is the willingness to accept input towards change.
Say a bit more about that.
People definitely have different approaches to accepting input. Some, you can tell by attitudes that some people are very unwilling to accept input towards anything new. Others are quite willing to accept input. They may not utilize it, but they'll let you know why they're not utilizing it. But what it does is it encourages that person to continue to give input. And certain organizations that I've been involved with certainly do not accept input well.
There's an old saying, in troubled organizations, ideas flow up and vetoes flow down. That's the absence of input. Absolutely. What are some other conditions or elements of a learning culture? Yes?
Well, I think everything we've heard so far is linked to this one, and that's open communication.
Open communication.
Fostering and promoting that communication.
Okay. It doesn't happen by itself. Where do mistakes fit into a learning culture? Any of your groups talk about that? Yes, in the back.
We kind of, as a value added to what's been said, we talked about when you make a mistake, what happens. And the word we threw up, the contribution we can make, is trust. How do I, as an employee, how am I sure? And one of our crew members said, we use the term, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears, so something goes wrong and nobody really heard about it or knew about it, why would you say anything about it? But certainly if something did go wrong and it was known, you're going to have to admit it all and that sort of thing. And the trust to where, will I be supported? Will I be ostracized, chastised, that sort of thing. So we thought that trust, and we kind of used trust seems to be the glue that's going to hold a lot of these other things together as we go on.
Okay, so now we got two thoughts here. One is a critical one, which is trust. Trust that your mistake will not be something which you're crucified for. But you want to accept all mistakes in a learning culture? Any and all mistakes? No. What kinds of mistakes do you accept, and what kind of mistakes do you reject?
I was just going to say, you hit on something I think is really important, is that you said a mistake is an opportunity for learning, and as a culture we think of a mistake as such a negative thing that we don't want that to happen. Obviously we don't want the wrong kinds of mistakes to happen.
Yeah. I mean,
we look at it as an opportunity.
There's a real important saying here, and I'll give you another proverb. Good decisions come from wisdom, knowledge, and experience. And wisdom, knowledge, and experience most often come from bad decisions. The fact is, we learn the most from our mistakes. They're vivid. You want to make sure those opportunities for learning aren't lost. Okay. What are some other elements of a learning culture? Any other observations in your table discussions?
I think it would be something that's explained up front. Here are the rules. Here's how we're going to pay the rules.
So very clear agreement and understanding of objectives and rules of the game.
Even the organization. This is how I want us to play. This is your first day, but I want to tell you, human nature is going to tell you to back off. and be quiet and sit in the corner. I don't want that. If you see something you don't understand, I want you to tell me.
Terrific. So creating the open communication with the rules. Anything else?
There's a mechanism for the communication process.
You need processes. This stuff doesn't happen by itself. That's why we're doing AARs. AARs are established processes to encourage communication. Okay, let me push on a few other ones. Feedback cycles, getting the information. In a learning organization, are they short or long? Short. Why are they short? Why is it important that your cycles be short? You want to use the information right away. As soon as it gets stale, it gets a lot less useful. Learning is a continuous process. It's part of everyday work in a learning culture. It's not an add-on, and it's not just at the end, it's during the work. All right, any other pieces that you want to add to the elements of a learning culture? Okay, let's take the second part. What ones have been most difficult and why? What's getting in the way, and what's the toughest pieces for the fire community? Yes, Dave.
David, for me, with the prescribed fire and the escapes and the reviews I've been on, and I think some other people have hit on this, and it's embarrassing to say for the Forest Service, but separating standard operating procedure, and I'll talk about mistakes, okay, when they have occurred, what is standard operating procedure and what is room for learning. This was an honest, judgmental error, you know, and there's learning to go on. Because frankly, most people will say, if you lose a prescribed fire or fire use event, it doesn't matter how good that plan looks, how good you've done anything, you burn a house down, you've done something wrong. And I don't know if there's an answer to that, but it's never clear in my mind right now.
So part of the difficulty is, how do you avoid the blame culture? The pinning of responsibility. We're going to find a scapegoat somehow. Yes.
And I think if you look at the track record, you're gonna see a pattern where the agencies have almost got it completely backwards. They hold people very accountable for decisions that were based on best available information, while allowing people to violate protocol without accountability. You know, it's almost completely flip-flopped.
Good.
The ability to communicate these things in between areas so we can learn from one another. We have no process for that to take it all the way through. We've got the AARs, they sit on somebody's desk, but as you talked about, we don't learn from one another on a broad scale.
Okay, so some of it is elevating it above the local learning so that we share it across. That's the hard part.
Yeah, decentralization.
Okay. Is there also a not invented here problem?
Yeah.
Which is, our region is different from your region.
Oh, yeah.
Our fires are different from your fires. So what could we possibly learn from each other?
Another thing, too, is I think our lack of practice. We do not practice the way we should, and I'll give you an example. Professional fire departments practice every day, every week, for something they might only witness once or twice in their whole career, a city block going, right? We go out and we'll be on 4, 5, 6 major incidents a year, and I don't know how many sub-incidents, and yet we are very poor, almost criminal, of not going back in a lot of our units and practicing. So it's either an OJT with weak practice. Some units might practice or train real well and then practice. I don't know, I'm not saying everybody. But I'd say as an organization, if we want to consider ourselves wildland fire professionals, both RX Fire and, we do not practice our skills.
Okay. Remember, there's a trilogy here. That you get trained, you practice, and then you execute. Right. And from what you say, we're reasonably good at the two ends, but we're not quite good enough in the middle.
I don't think that people intend, the managers
have bad intentions. I think everybody really wants to do a good job, and they think they're doing a good job. It's just that things like information overload, workload overload, those kinds of things keep us from making those vital changes in our organizations that we really need to make.
Okay, now let me ask the question that's sort of lurking behind this. There's a famous cartoon from Pogo. We have met the enemy, and it is us. Any truth to that? Okay. And it's an understandable set of choices. You're overloaded. The values are around being out there on the line, not practicing. Leadership is about getting the fire put out as quickly as possible or managing the burn. Behavior is a secondary issue. We often communicate unconsciously how much value we place in the kinds of activities we're talking about. And for often very good organizational region. But if you want to change the organization, it often starts with changing our own behavior. Okay, first process here is intelligence gathering. All I want you to understand here is there are lots of different ways to gather information on the environment. Search is what you do when somebody says, look it up on the internet. The data's out there. You got to find it. Inquiry is what you do when somebody says, it's in somebody's head. Go ask them the questions. Before they retire, we want to understand what's going on. Observation is needed because sometimes, often for social reasons, people can't or won't tell you the truth, particularly about how they actually make decisions or do their jobs. It means that you've got to collect your information from multiple sources. And you've got to cross-check your findings to make sure they're accurate. Now, this kind of process of gathering intelligence is really easy to do. I want to give you an example of something you could do tomorrow. Okay? Chad Holliday, who runs DuPont, every 2 weeks runs an hour-and-a-half telephone conversation, in his case with managers around the world. It's not a decision-making call. It's an intelligence-gathering call. He runs it like a seminar. So he'll start out and say, okay, what are you folks in Asia hearing about competitive action from Dow? Dow's their major competitor. Oh, they're moving in this area of chemicals. Those of you folks in Europe, are you hearing the same things? Latin America, are we hearing the same things? And he literally goes around the world sharing and comparing insights. GE considers this so important that in appliances, in the sales area, they do this weekly. Now think about it. This goes back to our short cycles. If you do it weekly, the furthest you can be behind is 1 week. This is why when we saw the Aspen fire, we went with the incident crew. I mean, that's why you have daily briefings. There's nothing that says you can't have these kinds of briefings when you're not fighting a fire. In order to stay in touch with weather, conditions, whatever it is you want to track. Because if you have a call once a week or once every 2 weeks, the most you can be behind is once a week or once every 2 weeks. Okay, so that's intelligence gathering. Now I want to say just a word about benchmarking. Benchmarking is the search for industry best practices that will lead to superior performance. You pursue those regardless of where they exist, in your own company, industry, or outside the industry. Now it turns out there are two approaches to benchmarking. There's one which you probably already use, and there's one which you might consider. The one that you already use is benchmarking as copying. So you find another region, or you go to Australia or Canada, and you visit their firefighting community, and you try to find practices that you can literally pick up, transfer over, and drop in with little or no change. That's a very powerful technique. It's only one approach to benchmarking. There's a second approach, which is benchmarking as a catalyst for creative thinking. Okay, I'll give you my favorite example. It comes from Mobil Oil. Mobil was trying to figure out how to improve the speed and service quality at its gas stations. Who did they benchmark? On speed, they benchmarked Roger Penske's Indianapolis 500 race team. Now, I don't know about you, but I have yet to get in and out of a gas station in 3.7 seconds. Can't do it. Doesn't make any sense. The idea was not to copy the practice. It was to give them food for thought. And in fact, the idea of the speed pass is just a prepaid credit card, actually was developed from the thinking of the speed team. Okay? They even experimented with a dedicated lane just for road warriors with the speed pass. Just like a pit crew, there's a dedicated lane. You can use the process to stimulate ideas. Who did the service team benchmark? They benchmarked the local Ritz-Carlton hotel. Turns out when they train new employees, the Ritz-Carlton takes a week. Obviously, they can't afford a week for new employees at a gas station. But they realized they didn't train them at all. They put in 1 hour of training up front, and they got huge improvements. So think of benchmarking also as a process which you can use to get creative ideas from other worlds, other sectors, other industries. One of the difficulties that you have in some of these reports on escape fires is that they're one-offs. It's hard to learn from one experience. What Boeing did was they compared 3.7 and 4.7, two problems, with 0.7 and 2.7, two successes. The differences jumped out pretty starkly. Second, they rotated the people from the project into line positions. If you're going to do it with staff, make sure they become line. If you're going to do it with line, make sure they get to apply what they've learned. Third, and most important, it comes back to the issue we heard before about trust. If you make this a witch hunt, if you make it a search for the guilty, you will learn nothing. Boeing is fortunate. Airframes are incredibly complex. They rely on lots of systems. It was pretty clear if there were problems with the 3.7 and 4.7, they were due to the systems, far more than they were due to individuals causing problems. They made this a search for systems problems that could be corrected, not individuals who had screwed up. Okay? Again, you can do it in lots of different ways. Small activities, entire burns, hires. Here are two great new hires, here are two new hires that didn't work out. What was it in the process that leads us to suggest we should do things differently? And finally, cultivate your own learning. If you learn, the people who work for you will learn as well. Now, there are several pieces to this. First, you need to remain open to new perspectives. That's why you're here. But often you need to recognize that you have local biases, regional biases. You need to get yourself out of your traditional comfort zone. Second, recognize your own personal biases. Now, they come in lots of forms. Some people like numbers. Some people like qualitative data. Some people like to work in small groups. Some people like to get information from large groups. It's not right or wrong. It will shape the dynamics, though. You should find people who are complementary to overcompensate for weaknesses. Third, and this is probably the most important on this particular list, as you get higher in the organization, more and more information comes to you pre-processed, already filtered, already digested and organized. There's a huge risk there. You lose touch with what's going on at the grassroots. Literally put yourself back on the line and do it periodically. If you don't, you won't be able to interpret the data. To make sense of the data, you got to expose yourself continually to the unfiltered, the raw material. And finally, and we talked about this before, and this is really, I'm going to skip through this, is really the appropriate place to end the learning material. Learning's an act of humility. It's an act that says we might not have gotten it exactly right. And as a result, we need to do things a little bit differently next time. Some of you are probably saying this learning organization stuff's pretty complicated. There's a lot of things we have to do. There's got to be some easier way. I got one more story to show you. I don't think there's an easier way. Story about a fellow who's out hiking. He's actually up here in the Rockies. Fairly steep trail, and he slips. He falls off the trail, and as he tumbles down the side of the cliff, he catches onto a little tree, a little twig. And he's dangling off the edge of the cliff, and he shouts, "Help me! Help me! Is there anybody up there?" And all of a sudden, the clouds roll in, and there's lightning, and there's thunder, and a voice comes down, and it says, "I'm up here." The fellow says, "Help me! Help me! Who's up there?" Voice comes down, and it says, "It is I, the Lord." The fellow says, "Help me, Lord! Help me!" Voice comes down, and it says, "Do you believe?" The fellow says, "Lord, this is really a very thin twig I'm hanging on to. I believe. I believe." Voice comes down, and it says, "Then let go." There's a pause, and the fellow looks up. He says, "Is there anybody else up there?" I'm afraid if you're really serious about organizational learning, there's nobody else up there. It really does require moving on these multiple fronts.
With David Garvin's learning techniques, we can improve the process of disseminating lessons learned throughout the wildland fire community. With your help in creating, acquiring, transferring, and retaining knowledge, we can purposefully modify our behavior in prescribed fire and fire use to reflect new knowledge and insights.
Hard way. That's learning. If there are any questions about why learning matters to the performance of the organization, any comments, any questions, please don't feel shy. I mean, this is really, the more interactive, the more interesting it'll be for everybody.
Well, we have to learn quickly because the consequences of something going wrong are getting worse. I mean, going back to your first slide that says the future ain't what it used to be. In the political environment, they're looking to hang us up. They want a scapegoat, and we're just trying to get a job done. And so if we screw up, we can't replicate it too many times before they take our toys away.
Okay, that's a very important point. I mean, one of the things that we'll talk about is that one of the tests you can use if you're a learning organization is, does the organization make the same mistake twice? Mistakes happen, and it's a fact of life. Now, you don't want mistakes to happen, but the real test is, did we make the same mistake a second time? Yes?
I don't think we're learning as fast as we should, Because every time you look at a fatality investigation or the findings, it all points back that we're doing the same mistakes over and over and over. We're just not learning.
Why do you think that is? Any thoughts?
Maybe the lack of experience in our leadership, because we're going through such a high turnover rate now. People are retiring, and I don't think we're catching up yet.
Okay, you've just generated another important test for whether or not you're a learning organization. If when key people leave, the learning goes with them, you don't have a
Noted author and Harvard business professor David Garvin has helped everyone from the U.S. Army to LL Bean and Boeing Aircraft to General Electric. He's a world expert at showing these complex organization managers how they can build more effective learning organizations, how they can transfer knowledge, how they can improve both their organization and themselves by acquiring, interpreting, and applying this knowledge. Garvin knows the hands-on tools for kickstarting and sustaining this vital cultural learning process. And Garvin's time-tested and proven methods really work. Now he's even inspiring the wildland fire community with his critical hands-on organizational learning practices and guidelines.
What I want to do here is I want to do 4 or 5 things. The first is I want to provide just a little bit of motivation. Now, we all did learning in school, but why is learning important for your work? Now, what difference does it make to be a learning organization? The second is I want to provide you with a pretty crisp definition. What is a learning organization? And then we can apply it to your own groups. The third, and this is where I want to spend most of the time, is I want to describe to you 6 critical activities that learning organizations do. Things like sharing knowledge across different parts of the organization. And I want to give you lots of practical examples, mostly from companies. That's where we're going to have to apply them, about how these things can be done. Literally stuff you could do Monday when you get back to work. So as practical, as grounded as possible. And then the fourth thing I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about what it means for you to lead learning processes. Because that really becomes part of your jobs if you're going to move the organization forward. And it's a little bit different from the traditional view of leadership. Now, the activity you're engaged in is not a competitive one. But fires are getting bigger and more complex. The only way you can get ahead of them is to learn. To learn from fire activities elsewhere, other regions, perhaps other countries. To share what you've learned on one fire with another group on a related fire. Or even in the course of day-to-day events, find out something done unusually well and quickly pass it on to the next group. And we'll see a lot of this in AARs. I mean, the Army found, for instance, when it was in Bosnia, first group of troops in, quickest thing they found was if you found a snow-covered road without tracks, it typically meant it was mined. You wanted to pass that information around as soon as you could to make sure no other units found it out. The learning organization. You have people who learn, but a real good litmus test is if when somebody has all the information in their head and they leave the organization and the organization loses its knowledge, you don't meet the test of a learning organization. There are 3 pieces. The first is leadership. And it's really up to you how you lead learning. Leading learning is different from the traditional model. The second is, do we have the right processes to ask those questions? That's what the AAR is really all about. But the third, which we're going to spend a fair amount of time on in a few minutes, is do we have the right culture? Because not every culture supports active learning. Some of them actually do a pretty good job of dampening or suppressing learning. Yes?
You know, another way to look at the fatalities that I tend to, the way I look at it, because we've been doing it for however long we've been fighting fires, that maybe we're teaching people to do something they just shouldn't be doing.
Say a bit more about that.
Well, we've been teaching people to go out and fight fire aggressively. Oh, by the way, do it safely. I'm a firm believer if we're going to break the cycle, maybe we shouldn't be going out and fighting fire aggressively.
Yeah, safety's a tough one. I mean, I'll tell you a little story about safety, because it's not the focus here, but it's something obviously you want to spend some time on. Paula mentioned that I'd done a fair amount of work with BP, British Petroleum. And they told me a wonderful story about safety, because they did not have the safety culture that they wanted to have. It was very much, go out on the rigs and drill for oil, and oh, by the way, be safe. And they invited some folks from DuPont to come and visit their oil rigs. Now, I don't know, for those of you who know safety, DuPont has the best safety record in the world on any measure. It's just astonishing. It's like invisible fatalities. And these two guys came out from DuPont to visit the BP oil rig. It's one of the rigs in the North Sea. They showed up, and you know, there are these safety boxes with all the special gear. They open up the first safety box. This is literally the start of their tour. And they can't believe their embarrassment. It's missing 2 life preservers, a few Band-Aids, some sterile gauze tape, and a few other relatively insignificant items. The BP guys, oh my goodness, we're really embarrassed. We'll write it up, and they move on. And the DuPont guys are still standing by the safety box. And they asked the guys from BP, what are you doing? And the BP guy said, well, we're continuing the tour. We'll write it up, we'll move on, we want to show you the rest of the rig. And the guys from DuPont said, you don't understand, do you? Shut it down. Guys from BP said, what? DuPont says, shut it down. There's a discrepancy. That's the way you get safety. There's no grays here. Either you met the standards or you didn't. So safety is a tough one. We may circle back to it.
This came out because our new forest supervisor in our forest, he just flat said, we're not going to do what we've been doing in the past. And if that means we're not going to go out and fight fire, we're not going to do it. Because there isn't one life that's worth doing that. We're going to try a new approach here.
Let's say we always talk about fatalities, but